Hello, BookTube. Well, as you can see, I have a guest. This is my friend Zach from the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston.
Hi,
The
BookTube.
third most requested guest star on this channel.
Where's Frida?
No, Frida's not a guest star. She's always here. You're just getting needlepoint Frida today, but still, 3 is better than a lot.
Sure, I'll take it.
And Zach has worked forever and ever at the Brattle Bookshop in downtown Boston. For those of you who don't know what it is, I'd be amazed if you watch this channel. You know, it's a used bookstore, but also key to our discussion today, an antiquarian bookstore. There's the sale lot outside where you can find me, including right now. I'm broadcasting from the sale lot. And then there's 2 floors of the shop, which are just an ordinary retail bookstore or used bookstore.
That's right.
Double stack books, relatively good order, tons and tons of selection and overturn. But then there's a 3rd floor where Steve never goes.
Been up there a couple times.
But usually just to talk to Ken. Usually just to talk to the proprietor. Not usually. I never go up there. Never. And you, of course, you're at the opposite end of the moral spectrum, aren't you? You're in the basement.
I am. I'm in the off-limits basement where a lot of the work of the shop is done. A lot of the researching and pricing and moving and carrying, all of the dirty work that has to happen before the books are actually fit to be browsed.
And you're in the basement, even though the basement stairs have tried on multiple occasions to kill you.
Steve, if I made a list of all the things in the Brattle that have tried to kill me in the last not quite 20 years, but almost, then I'd have no time for anything else.
Well, we have a subject today, and that subject is near and dear to the 3rd floor, and one of the book subjects on which I am not well versed. And Zach is an expert. You won't say it, but one of the best experts in the country.
Well, that might be going a little too far, but I will say one of the reasons you're not an expert on it, because I don't know if I've ever met a person who loves books more and is less interested in the physical book than Steve. And I think it's my sort of pet theory that people who love books, you fall somewhere on a spectrum between people who love the text and people who love the physical object of books, and nobody is 100% one side or the other. But I think, Steve, you're probably pushing a few standard deviations towards text.
The closest that I get is that there are some types of bindings or covers that I like.
That's right.
I don't care. I don't go out and collect them.
Well, while I'm probably outside the normal curve on the other side.
You know what annihilates that curve? E-books.
What's that?
Ebooks annihilate that curve.
Ebooks
are only. That's all you're getting.
Ebooks are off that chart. they don't.
Although this does remind me of a conversation that I had with a very blue-haired Massachusetts progressive once on a whole bunch. We ranged a whole bunch of subjects, and the more bad 50-year-old dad jokes I told, the more her face sort of strumped up on one side. So I thought she was having a stroke. And then finally, at the end of the conversation, she said, "Well, whether it comes to critical race theory or autism or social awareness, no matter what the spectrum is, we don't want you." So I guess I'm not welcome on any spectrum.
Well, you're always welcome at the shop, impossibly.
Notice the beautiful air. But what we're talking about today is collectible books, which of course I'm a stranger to collectible books. But Zach, it's your stock and trade.
It certainly is, and we
get 10 boxes of books from some guy in Acton. You have to know if 8 of those boxes are garbage. The whole difference between you and a normal employee is that you have to know if one of the boxes has something in it that's a mortgage payment.
That's right. And when it comes to first editions, first edition sort of in popular parlance has come to mean almost just a valuable book. the way people sort of use the terminology. And by far the most common question we get, other than do we have a public restroom, is how can I tell if my book is a first edition? And it's a tough question to answer because the real answer is it's not a simple enough question to answer, with a few criteria.
Now, why wouldn't that be true? The last time you and I were talking privately on this subject, when I should have been writing and you should have been working, I was just standing there talking. When the customers come up and say, "I'm sorry, I've got a question," and we say, "Yeah, yeah." But the last time I was talking to you on the subject, you throw a whole bunch of obviously made up terms at me of the first edition, first printing, first run, first high school crush, all its deviations to make on why is it difficult? Why isn't the first edition the first printed version of the book? Why isn't that true?
In some cases, that is true. And in some cases, it's very simple because there was only one edition. In fact, with most books that have ever been published, that have ever been printed, there is only one edition. So there's no difference between the first edition, first printing, because there was only one printing. But it can get complicated and get very complicated because really going back to the dawn of printing. And one of the big problems, sort of to take a 30,000 feet view of this, one of the problems in talking about first editions now is that most of the terminology talking about differences between copies of a certain edition, most of the terminology comes from what we call the hand press period, which roughly speaking is from about 1450, starting with Gutenberg and sort of the invention of the Western printing method, and about 1800 or so, when various sort of industrialized and mechanized processes took over a lot of printing and publishing. So now, as I see your face going, I know this face well. You look.
Partly the squint was due to the little nod you gave when you said Gutenberg.
Yeah.
Which could either, with most people, the little nod would be, "You've heard of him." And I always wonder when you do it if it's you went to school with him.
Yeah, you were a class behind him.
Methuselah.
Yeah.
I will try to not scrimp up the face.
Exactly.
Go on, please.
So to put it pretty simply, with any sort of edition of a book, it's sort of a hard thing to define, but it's something that we all sort of know what it is. And an edition of the book is basically a version of the text. And for something to be considered a new edition, there have to be substantial changes to the text. The sort of rule of thumb in bibliography is about half of the text has to have changed in some way for a version of a text to be called a new edition. The problem is, with a lot of editions of texts, there are a lot of changes that aren't as substantial as that, but still are, can be sort of described as differences in the text within that edition. So the terms that I threw at you probably when we were having our conversation, where your eyes were like always on the verge of glazing over, the terms I probably said were edition, impression or printing, issue, and state. That's sort of the hierarchy. That's the, if you can think of it, no first love in there. But yeah, so those are the big terms. So all of those, the impression, issue, and state fall under edition, and they're different. They're all describe different types of changes to the text that don't make it a new edition, but still make it a different version of the text, often where you can determine priority. So you can determine a certain issue was done before a different issue. A certain state was printed and published before versions of the text with another state.
So
And
do these different states form
yes,
a ladder in all cases? Is it always that you're trying to peel back the layer to the first edition minus all the rest of it?
yes.
Or are
So
some of the
the
intervening states, the later states, collectible in their own right?
well, another frustrating answer, and most of the answers I give people tend to be frustrating. Sometimes is the answer, and maybe is the answer. Sometimes a book is valuable, even if it's a later state, a later issue, or a later edition. And I actually brought a couple examples of those. Sometimes you can have the absolute first available copy that was printed, and it's, no one cares. Like I said, every book came out in a first edition, and most of them people aren't that interested in. So really, when we talk about first editions and sort of the collectible market and the fetishism associated with first edition hunting, we're talking about books that are in some way popular, in some way sought after, that collectors and readers sort of gravitate.
So would the fact that most books never get a second edition account for what bitter a-holes most authors are?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Not 100%, but it's definitely a factor. Yeah.
So
not everyone's genius is recognized. And as I'm sure you can argue, a lot of recognized geniuses are maybe not so much.
I've done my best to unrecognize geniuses.
That's
you all recognize this genius. Could I revoke that, please?
Yeah.
So hasn't worked much in the years, but nevertheless, I keep trying.
So one more thing, just to bring it back to sort of the idea of these terms developing to describe books from the hand press era. So books that were printed before about 1800. The problem is they're still the terms we use to describe modern first editions. Your collectible novels that most people, when they think of a first edition, you think of the first edition of The Great Gatsby.
Right.
You think of
or Infinite Jest.
Or which, funny you should mention it. The problem is the terminologies of printing, issue, and state don't always adapt very well to modern printing, because the books are made a lot differently than they were.
But as a slight counterweight to that, I could be wrong about this completely, but I get the impression that after the printing press, at least the process would be easier to track. Seems to me the hand press era would be a nightmare to determine what is or what isn't.
Well, there are whole scholarly fields devoted to the field of analytical bibliography, sort of taking the physical object and trying to determine the process that made it. A lot of bibliography is trying to determine priority, meaning which variant came first within variants of a text. You can go through for instance, the first folio of Shakespeare. There might not be two identical copies of the first.
That's kind of what I meant.
Shakespeare.
Whereas after the printing press, at least that element is taken out. Because
Steve. No, not necessarily. One thing I'll say is a term that we find all of the time, and this is with modern books too. So you see these shelves behind me. These are all reference books. These are all bibliographies. So, and I have these precisely to determine if a book is a first edition or not, which state it is, which issue it is. This is sort of an answer to people who ask, how can I tell if something is a first edition? Sometimes you can't without a lot of reference material.
Really?
Sometimes you can tell pretty easily.
Now
but it's not always easy.
You're right.
Let me just to finish that point. A lot of variants, even in modern books, it's not yet determined or impossible to determine if one has priority over the other. A lot of times in bibliographies, you'll see variant A, variant B, variant C.
There are variants now?
Established.
We're adding another term.
Variant is sort of a catch-all term for an impression in issue estate. Those are all types of variants. Variant just means difference in the text.
But isn't the ladder still in place? Wouldn't the ladder still be strictly chronological? Which of these happened before the other?
Yeah, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's
how is that
not
possible in the modern era? You need 60 people to clock into the factory in order to make the second one. They're going to know that they weren't there, that they didn't do this on Monday, they did this on Wednesday. How is that not traceable?
Well, part of it is you have to always remember that publishing and printing was a business, and some businesses keep meticulous records and archive them, and some are much more haphazard, especially when you're talking about sort of small operations, if you're talking about privately printed things, if you're talking about surreptitiously printed books.
Almost necessarily. So once again, it's all Virginia Woolf's fault.
I would never say that. Do not quote me on that. I do not want to deal. Don't at me with any of those.
But you're right. When you're not in the basement, you're right there on the front lines.
Yeah, yes.
At the Brattle. One of the things about the two things about the Brattle that I love. One is that when you walk in the door, you're going to get somebody who has authority at the shop. They're not hiding from the customers. They love the customers. And two is, I imagine, a philosophy that you take straight from the shop's owner, who took it straight from his father, which is that we're in the business of selling you books. The religious veneration stuff you can leave to your own private use. We're just going to sell you things. So that's right. So you're at ground zero when some customer comes in from the suburbs saying this is a first edition, when it isn't.
Yes. Well, or I'll say just as often as those times when it's not a first edition, it is a first edition, but not the right variant of the first edition to be collectively valuable in the way they want it to be. And we're going to go back to your favorite David Foster Wallace right now. The first edition of his magnum opus, Infinite Jest. Came put out by a major publishing house. The first edition of that, of the book, which you can read on the copyright page, which is the reverse of the title page, it stated first edition on that part. However, there was a misprint in the first X number of dust jackets for that book. On the rear flap, there's a blurb from the author William Vollmann. And on the first X number of those dust jackets that they printed, they misspelled his name. His last name has 2 N's, and they only printed it with 1. So to be technically the collectible first edition, the first edition that gets the collectible price that collectors want, a quote true first edition, that's sort of the terminology that's used now to say the first available copy. It has to have that dust jacket with Vollmann spelled with 1 N.
You're telling me there are collectors out there who will zero in on a tiny little N.
Every single person, I'd say 95% of the people who want to buy a first edition of Infinite Jest, will pay you. And the market, the way the market goes, you'll pay 2 to 3 times.
I was just about to ask you what a difference
for
that
the true first edition with the jacket with the priority variant. And then
wait, hold on. Is that what it's called? A priority variant?
Well, it's a variant with priority is the terminology used to say this feature, this variant, whether it be a state in issue, it comes before, is the first. Now, sometimes, go ahead.
Those things make the book collectible.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a first edition if you have a copy with the dust jacket where they corrected and put the second N on Volman.
But it's the
It's
nobody
not
cares.
the true, it's not the quote true first edition. And in fact, as a member of the ABAA, which is the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, it would be an ethics violation for me to offer for sale a copy with the second state of that jacket, which is what you would call that type of variant, to call that a first edition without the qualifier that
No
it's in
kidding.
the second state dust jacket. It'd be an
And the
ethics
reason would be because if you send that thing, if somebody buys it over the mail and you send it to them, the very first thing they're going to look for is that N.
Exactly. I would be misrepresenting the copy.
That is fascinating. Now, I might be jumping the gun here on what you want to talk about, but this leads me inevitably to asking meta questions. Why?
Yeah.
Why is this? Why do people care about this? That's partially a cry from the heart because I don't, but also you must ask the question yourself. It's the bread and butter, the upper end of the store.
Yeah.
I mean, the Brattle has lots of good custom from the dollar books out on the sale lot, but you also make money from the third floor.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Why do people care?
On this question.
Why do they care about this sort of thing? If you care about it that much, if you care about that little N that much, you're obviously never, ever, under any circumstances, going to pull that copy of Infinite Jest off the shelf and read it. You're obviously not going to do that.
You'll have a reading copy. No, paperback.
That's two copies of a really crappy book instead of only one. Why would you?
Steve, it took you like 5 minutes of talking about this book before you.
Sorry, my back's acting up. It took me a while to work it. I swear, you people that are listening who never get to the Brattle, you don't know. The whole staff just knows what they're getting when I walk in the door. Oh my God. Because I don't change what they're getting. And I haven't in 50 years.
So it's one note, but it's an entertaining note.
It's my sole clutch at salvation is that it's entertaining. But you must have better insight into why people care about this sort of stuff.
Well, in some sense, and
how many times have you seen people bankrupt themselves, spend money they don't have to acquire that little N?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it happens. I hope it doesn't come to that. But to take a step back and look at the meta question, in some sense, it's a rational pursuit to a point. And what I mean when I say that is there is something, just sort of in our human psyche that's attracted to the first version of something. And to be able to have the copy that was the first available, the first one that someone could have bought and read, there's something to that. Now, not to you, because you're way over on the other side of my
I winced when you said it, because when you say it's something in human nature that values the first of anything, you're feeding right into first kid narcissism. They're always the worst.
I am an oldest child.
They're always the worst.
So I will grant that if you reject that idea, then collecting first editions is not for you, and that's okay. But I think there is some reason behind that.
But I'm just sputtering at this end, because
well, let me ask you this.
You can't use it. You can't use the thing you're collecting. What sense does that make? If you collect it, if you save up all year long for a great minor Victorian painting, you buy it at auction, you spend a little more than you thought, you put it up on the wall, you get to look at it every day.
Well, art's a lot more expensive than books. So I understand where you're coming from, but if you don't subscribe to that idea, then you're not somebody who's going to be interested in collecting books as physical objects. Now, I will say I don't uncritically subscribe to that, theory of why a first edition is important. Especially because there are lots of other editions of books that are just as important, I feel. And I really hope that collecting can sort of expand to accommodate
Wait, what does
that
that
and
mean?
appreciate that. Well,
Another edition
I'll
be
get back to that in a second. The example I like to use is the first edition of James Joyce's Ulysses, another book that I think if we were going to make a list of Steve's, your greatest hits of books that you claim no one has ever read and enjoyed, but will lie about it every time they're asked. Infinite Jest, and I know Ulysses would be on that list that you made. But it is a foundation of the English language canon, and it is a highly collectible first edition. But one thing about that first edition, it is riddled with textual errors. It has a ship's manifest of an errata list at the end of the book, pointing out all of the misprints. And misprints, yeah.
Okay. So not bad prose.
No, no. Again, I would never say that. Don't at me. Direct those to Steve. But it is the first edition, but it's not a great version of the text. And one of the sort of theoretical ideas of a first edition being important is, in theory, it's sort of the most, it's the closest version to the author's vision of the text before other people got a hold of it and could revise it, and after his or her death could edit it and revise it without the author's overseeing, without the author's intent. The problem is the truth about most first editions is they're still printed by printers, edited by editors, and a lot of misprints happen in text. So very often the first edition of a text is not the best version of the text. In fact, most of the time it isn't.
So very often the first edition of the text is causing the author himself to pull his hair out.
Absolutely, and that was the case with Joyce. And that
maybe
so,
he was so frustrated he should have killed himself.
Moving on.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. That is the classic 1,000-mile sigh of the Brattle, the Steve sigh. Oh, he's done it again.
another interesting example of that phenomenon is the first edition of The Great Gatsby, which you can determine the true first edition by a small handful of misprints in the text. And they were corrected in a second printing of it, which is otherwise indistinguishable from the first edition. But
it is distinguishable. You would know.
It is absolutely distinguishable, and there is priority established. So you have the first edition, and then the second printing, which has those small handful of corrections. So you have the second printing actually a better, more authoritative version of the text. A funny little additional nugget about that particular one. The first edition of Great Gatsby, very collectible book, expensive book, not a rare book. They actually printed a lot of them.
Thanks to This Side of Paradise, right?
Yeah. If you, I'll say this, if you needed 10 copies in your hand by next Wednesday and money were no object, I could get you 10 copies in your hand by next Wednesday. I have no doubt this is the case. It would cost a lot of money, but you could do it. The second printing of Great Gatsby, which doesn't get nearly the collectible price, is actually much more scarce. They printed far fewer of that corrected second printing. So it's actually a much more rare book, but not nearly as collectible, not nearly as valuable, even though it is
But there are first edition there are first editions out there where the exact opposite is true, where you're lucky if you see one in 10 years of looking, right?
Absolutely. But a first edition, again, oftentimes it gets used as a synonym for rare book or valuable book, and it's just not. And that's one of the things, when I say we get a lot of questions at the shop, and a lot of them is, how can you tell a first edition? One frustration people usually have is I can't give them a simple answer to do it, because there is no simple answer about how to do it. But the other frustration is it usually doesn't matter. And it's also probably not what they really want to know when they're asking their question. Usually people want to know, are their books valuable?
Oh, okay. Which isn't always okay.
I'll just to.
But the answer to that is always no, too, almost all the time.
almost always, because most books aren't valuable. That's what makes the valuable ones, interesting. And that's what makes certain rare ones valuable. But another thing I'll say, just to talk about another aspect, a book doesn't have to be a first edition to be valuable. I brought an example here. This is actually one of the more valuable books we have in the shop at the moment. This is a 1727 edition. Let's see if I can't quite get. You can see the portrait of an elder Isaac Newton there, and then the lighting's not quite. There we go. You can see this is the third edition of his Principia Mathematica. So it's not the first edition, which was done in the 1680s. It's the third edition, but it's still an extremely valuable book. It's a $20,000 book. But it's also the last edition that he himself worked on. He edited it. So it is the authoritative version of the Principia. So, and it took him 3 editions to do there. To do it, had he lived longer, there might have been a 4th that was the most authoritative text. So even though it's not the first edition, there's a lot. It doesn't, take much to convince somebody that there's value in this version of the text. And
even though they could go out to the sale lot and get a Dover paperback reprint of that exact same thing,
which is based on this edition, because that's Newton's last edition. So, but oftentimes it takes a lot more convincing to talk to somebody and to tell them why a later edition of another type of work is just as important. And there can be lots of reasons, but I used the word fetishism before, and that's what a lot of first edition and sort of point fetishism. Point is another synonym in this terminology for variant. It can sort of lose all intellectual coherence.
How bad does that get? Are there people out there who will collect not only the very first, most prior edition of something, but all other editions and variants of that same book? So they'll have just a whole bookcase of.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I tend to think that's a more interesting and more fruitful version of collecting. I have a collection of the novel Master and Margarita that sort of follows collecting on those lines. You can sort of see the whole evolution of the text. Yeah, exactly. I find that fascinating. And if you're just collecting the true first edition, the first published version of a text, you're missing a lot of the story of that book. So I try to encourage collectors to look a little deeper. They're interesting avenues collecting things other than the High Point first editions.
High Point.
Oh, one thing, High Point, yeah. So High Point, would
That's
be
the term. Oh my.
high points of literature. Your Ulysses, your first editions of the Brontes and Jane Austen, your sort of Western canon, big collectible books that have probably been turned into bad movies. Those are high points in literature collection. One area of collecting that is also, certainly interesting are advanced review copies, which I know you have a fondness for, because those are the copies you often read when you're writing your review. Now,
those are collectible?
Here's a galley or uncorrected proof of Dennis Johnson's first novel, Angels. Now, this, even though it was printed before the first edition of that book, is not considered the first edition because this was never available to the public. This was never offered for sale. It isn't a published version of the text. And they're still collectible, but it's not considered the first edition in a bibliographic sense, because one of the conditions to be, in edition of the book is that it was published. It was offered.
What kind of a public are we talking about here? How big a public does it have to be? What if it's a privately printed thing? Just 75 copies of something. Is that
it can be the distinction there. It was published privately and distributed privately.
Okay.
Which is sort of it's sort of a subcategory, but it would have to be to describe that book correctly, you'd have to distinguish it as such. So there are all different kinds of, this tree has a lot of branches
that we need to cover. We're almost out of time now, but will you come back? Can we go at it again?
I will certainly come back.
I've got a million more questions.
Then I will. I cannot guarantee answers, but I can guarantee responses.
Fantastic. Well, let's wrap this up before we get cut off mid-word. But I have a million more questions. Come back to talk about collectible editions. Everybody's interested in that except